Welcome to today's review. We are talking about none other than Sir Francis Bacon. And I have here a Classic Club edition of a collection of his works, both the essays that he wrote between around 1590 and 1620, with topics ranging from the justice system to the feng shui of different architectural design elements and gardens. And the other thing included in this book is his science fiction work called New Atlantis, which he didn't get to finish during his lifetime, but was published shortly after he passed in 1626. New Atlantis is a science fiction work that takes place in an isolated island called Ben Salem, and it's very much so in the fictional science fiction realm of things like Atlantis, or more modern things like Wakanda, where it's this isolated piece of land that is superior technologically and in all societal respects. It's a utopian vision that he was writing of. A little bit about Francis Bacon. He was born the 8th child of his father's second marriage, and due in part to that, he received no inheritance from his father's estate, yet showed extraordinary precociousness, attending Cambridge University at the age of 12, where he caught the eye and attention of the likes of Queen Elizabeth I, who he would later on in life become a advisor for. Now, because this is two books in one, if you even want to consider essays a book, they're a series of philosophical takes that Francis Bacon wanted to try and emulate the likes of Aristotle with, and to be a contemporary version of Aristotle for his time. Reading essays, I understand why Bacon is hailed as a thought leader with the influence that he had on the scientific method, expertly engaging with inductive reasoning and empiricism. However, being an Anglican and strongly influenced by his faith, Bacon also reserves some level of humility, I guess you would say, in regards to the extent of scientific knowledge, with a understanding that there's certain knowledge that is only attained by revelation. A little bit about how I found this book. It was at a local bookstore just a few blocks away from where I live, called Source Bookstore, which is one of the coolest bookstores I've ever been in. And as it happens, it's the oldest running used bookstore in all of Iowa. And walking through there, you could spend a whole day. They've got, I think, 2 floors. So they've got a main floor, and then they've got a basement, and it's wall to wall covered in books and VHS tapes and record players. But for any book lovers, and especially vintage books, you would have a heyday there. It's like a candy store. I felt like a kid in a candy store there. With regards to this particular book that I picked out, I was already interested in learning more about Francis Bacon and reading his works based off of him being an acclaimed author from his time period, and just generally. And then when I saw that they had a Classic Club's edition of his work, I knew I had to get it. So I'm actually going to go ahead and read some excerpts from this book that made me fall in love with his style of writing, the perspective that he had on different topics that I think are still relevant. There are opinions that I think are still relevant to today. So this first excerpt I'm going to read is from his third essay titled Of Unity in Religion. And in here he's discussing how the body of Christ, spiritually speaking, when there's a schism in it, it's a cause for people both leaving the faith and also keeping unbelievers out of the faith. It kind of works negatively both ways, and we can learn that from Jesus' own words as well, saying that a house divided against itself cannot stand. And he often goes on long, prolonged sentences to explain his point of view, and this is one of his particularly poignant ones. Concerning the means of procuring unity, men must beware that in the procuring of religious unity, they do not dissolve and deface the laws of charity and of human society. There be two swords amongst Christians, the spiritual and temporal, and both have their due office and place in the maintenance of religion. But we may not take up the third sword, which is Muhammad's sword, or like unto it, that is, to propagate religion by wars, or by persecutions, to force consciences, except it be in cases of overt scandal, blasphemy, or intermixture of practice against the state, much less to nourish seditions, to authorize conspiracies and rebellions, to put the sword into the people's hands, and the like, tending to the subversion of all government, which is the ordinance of God. And then turning to Essay 5 of Adversity, Bacon poignantly states that the virtue of prosperity is temperance. The virtue of adversity is fortitude, which in morals is the more heroical virtue. Prosperity is the blessing of the Old Testament. Adversity is the blessing of the New, which carrieth the greater benediction and the clearer revelation of God's favor. And he concludes with, certainly virtue is like precious odors, most fragrant when they are incensed or crushed. For prosperity doth best discover vice, but adversity doth best discover virtue. And this alludes well to the Beatitudes message that Jesus preaches about blessed are those who are poor in spirit and those who mourn. On a similar note, in essay number 34 of Riches, Bacon says that riches gotten by good means and just labor paces slowly, but when they come by the death of others, as by the course of inheritance, testaments, and the like, they come tumbling upon a man. And this is sort of an extrapolation from what he quotes earlier in this essay of Proverbs 18:20, and that I think plays hand in hand with that idea of adversity being something that leads to greater virtue than the blessing of prosperity, which leads to more temptation. And lastly, essay number 50 of Studies is probably Bacon's most memorable witticism throughout all of the essays. And he says, some books are to be tasted, others to be swallowed, and some few to be chewed and digested. That is, some books are to be read only in parts, others to be read but with great care, and some few to be read wholly, and with diligence and attention. As far as any criticisms of Bacon's work that I would have is just that the writing can be antiquated with the language that it was originally written in being Latin, and the fact that it was written over 400 years ago. And because it was written over 400 years ago in a different language, it's hard to consider that a fault. That just made it a little difficult to interpret what exactly he was getting at with some of the essays. The parts that I quoted back to you were the parts that came through the most clearly to me and that I felt were relevant. Overall, I've got to say this is some of the best philosophy I've probably ever read. And, you know, philosophy is only as good as you're willing to engage in the ideas, because it's, opinions of intellectuals who are trying to derive meaning and make sense out of what is and can be a very confusing world. But I think he stands and fits in with the greatest in the subject, and for that reason I would definitely recommend him to those who are interested in the subject of philosophy. And even though New Atlantis wasn't completely finished, for the 40 pages or 50 pages that there are of it, it flowed and was had my attention locked throughout the entire thing as you're learning about and exploring this fictional world that he created, which exists in a form of reality of these explorers discovering this island called Ben Salem, which had been discovered by a Bartholomew, one of Jesus's disciples. And so it was a society that was founded on the gospel, and that was something that shaped their whole society. And he was a big believer in scientific advancement as being a means of creating a more just and moral society. I think oftentimes as Christians, they tend to want to divide science from religion, but Bacon, he saw that it was part of God's calling on his life to, and something that would share and show the glory of God through scientific studies. Whether or not you agree with that, I just think that's an interesting perspective to consider, especially coming from somebody 500 years ago. And obviously, science is a very different field nowadays, but that was one of the forefathers there. How Francis Bacon ended his life was actually in quite a bit of scandal, being accused of bribery. Unfortunate as that is, I think it brings attention to a more interesting perspective, which is that the truth is greater than the sum of its parts. So whether or not it's true that he was guilty of bribery, reading his work, you can see that he had a strong understanding of right and wrong. And I think that oftentimes we can be too quick, whether it be artists or writers, authors, political leaders, we can be too quick to write somebody off because of one wrong or even a series of wrongs, and not see or hear when truth is being spoken. The wheat will always come out from the chaff, I believe, and Francis Bacon, he had a lot of wheat that is evidenced through his writings, and those who would care to dive into his bibliography, I think will gain a lot of value of interest. But yeah, that's it for today's review of Francis Bacon's essays and New Atlantis. Let me know if there's any books that you would like me to read or review, and I'll take a look, and if I'm interested, I'll read it and come back on here with a review.